Hello. For a channel that says storytelling through words and art, I sure haven't done much talking about words. And that's interesting because I write a lot more than I do art. So let's balance things out here as I critique some of my old writing. I both cringe and laugh looking this over. It's from before I'd ever finished an entire draft of a novel, and now I've drafted 4 novels and 6 novellas, or something like that. I thought my writing was pretty good back then, but now I see it's full of beginner's mistakes. Which is fine, since I was a beginner. You won't learn anything unless you're okay with it being really cringy to start. So, if you're looking at this and thinking, that's what my writing looks like as I roast it, don't be discouraged. It just means you have room to grow, and hopefully watching me critique this will help you learn to catch these things in your own writing. I don't share all of my old writing because I do want to revise and get some of it published, but this is from the first half draft attempt I did of a story in early 2019. The entire thing has changed so drastically, from character names to personalities to world building, that it's basically unrecognizable based on the opening scene. I won't be focused on catching everything, because honestly, what this needs is a total rewrite, which I did. I'm just going to be mentioning some things that jump to mind first. So, here we go. So, to start off, this is scene 1, chapter 1 of a novel that is an action adventure novel. Later became a fantasy novel. It wasn't here, it was just action adventure. And we have 2 paragraphs about the government system and the legislation that King Alexander is attempting. And that is what is known as info dumping, where, to start off the story, it's just lots of information. Now, sometimes you have to have info dumping in a story, especially like a high fantasy or a science fiction story where there is so much going on in the world. But you don't want to do that in your 2 opening paragraphs. There is some world building, this stuff is important to talk about, but it is not so important that it must be talked about before there's any introduction to the characters or the setting or anything like that. The reader has no reason to care about the government system or where the power should rest in terms of the government. So this info dumping, instead of being like 2 paragraphs right at the beginning of the story, it should be threaded into what people are saying, the conversations they're having, in the actions that are going on. It should come naturally and not be here. So yeah, step 1, to make a good story, do not make your first 2 paragraphs just governmental system. That is really incredibly boring. Now, next, okay, so we've got through those paragraphs about the government system. Now we can actually look at a character. And here is the Crown Princess, who is one of our 2 main characters. And the thing about this scene is it's just not very memorable. The character is not doing something that the reader cares about too much, not doing something that shows who she is as a person. I do get the sense from this that she's a little bit nervous and that she is forgetting things, but I don't get a sense as to how nervous she is or why she might be nervous or anything like that. Then we have Destiny's eyes widened in shock. Oh my goodness. And then she says, "I can't believe I almost did that." That feels like a bit much. It is more than is needed to convey how she's feeling about this. And perhaps more than, or better than her eyes widening in shock, would be something more along the lines of her face palming or rolling her eyes in exasperation or something like that. But her eyes widening in shock, and then she exclaims, because you'll note the exclamation point here too, "I can't believe I almost did that." And it's just much. Then we have this bit of world building here. the tabloids would have a field day with the princess showing up to the royal council in her fuzzy socks. Yes, they would. They absolutely would. And that shows us a little bit about the world building, but in a more natural way. So that's good, but the way it's phrased could be better. And this is another one of those things that I think could have been woven in more naturally. Maybe she remembers something a tabloid has done, or better yet, she might at some point during the story look and see that a tabloid ran a smear story on somebody for making a stupid mistake. That would be a better way to incorporate that in, as compared to just stating it outright here. But it is a good detail to have things like this, that like talking about tabloids in this story world, which didn't make it into the more recent drafts of it because it is a very different sort of place. But anyway, it tells you a lot about the world. Now here, instead of looking at a bigger picture thing, this is just a really little thing on punctuation, and it would be the difference between a dialogue tag and an action beat, because what I did here is I combined the two. So a dialogue tag is something like Sylvie said, Sylvie asked, Sylvie exclaimed. But here, it's an action beat. She is doing something, and that done in the same paragraph as her quote tells us who's speaking and what they're doing as they're saying it. What I have here is the punctuation as if it were a dialogue tag, but obviously it's not. It's an action beat. So what it should be, instead of being the same sentence, just separated out with a comma, there should just be a period right there. So it is now two separate sentences, and now that's grammatically correct. Alternatively, we could make it a dialogue tag, and then Sylvie said, shooing Destiny out. And this is also grammatically correct. I like it better with an action beat. It is a preference thing, and you'll want to do it mixed in both ways. If you always do dialogue tags, it'll look unnatural. If you always do action beats, it'll look unnatural. So you do want a good mix in there. Now, here, once again, Destiny is looking at the mirror, and she was looking at the mirror earlier in this as well. And I just am bringing this to the forefront because there is this trope in stories where near the beginning, the character will look at a mirror and notice their appearance. And that's how the writer, oh so subtly, tells the reader what they look like. I did not do that, but just mentioning the mirror so many times in the first chapter is going to make the reader probably remember stories where that's happened, or it'll just feel a bit cliche or tropey. Too tropey. Tropes are good. Too many is not good. So typically, unless it were very plot relevant, like a character who has superpowers related to mirrors, I don't even mention mirrors right at the beginning of a story, just for that reason. Now, next up, there are two things that came up. So first of all, she is absent-mindedly nodding a greeting to the guards. Then she broke out of her thoughts to wave a greeting in return. And the thing I can't tell is what she's thinking about. Like, why is she absent-minded? Why is she breaking out of her thoughts? What are these thoughts she's breaking out of? I'm the one who wrote this, and I have no idea what's going on in her brain. I think the reason I had those in there is because I wanted her to seem a little bit absent-minded, but also this is normal life. It's not abnormal to have people greeting her. But I think she could have been much more interesting and memorable if we know what is going on inside her head. And again, why is she nervous? She seemed nervous before, and maybe a little skittish because of the tabloids, but I think we could dive deeper into her head there. And that would make her a much more relatable character. So, next up, we are jumping back to big picture things, and this is something that relates to how much research I had done for the story. So even though the king was working to increase the voters' power by limiting the power of the monarchy, because King Alexander is a good king that way, the previous Senate had been sharply opposed to this. What Senate ever would be opposed to limiting the monarchy's power, which would in turn increase their power? This makes no sense. This is totally opposite from how real-world politics work. So if you want it to be a believable story world, you need to look at how things actually work in the real world. Even though it's a fictional story, it should reflect reality. And the fact is, governing bodies want power. They do not object when the king says, I want you to have more power. Then, looking at this is another info dumping paragraph, and I think this could have been incorporated more naturally. And I know the reason I didn't. It's because this is an action-adventure story. Later in the story, there's an assassin running around, and people are crashing through the forest across the world to escape from him. And I don't know, it's pretty cool, even if this version of the story was a dumpster fire. But I wanted to make sure the boring political stuff did not take that big a role in it. But it actually is really important, so to make the plot make sense. So I should have incorporated that more naturally, let it take more time. And I could have made actual action take place earlier in the story if I thought it would be too much time for this. But yeah, this paragraph should not be here as a singular paragraph. Now, this paragraph's a little bit of a dumpster fire, but we're not going to talk about that. We're going to look at this. This dialogue feels very forced. Like, I clearly put it in here because I wanted to advance the scene. And that's okay for a first draft, because this is a first draft, but definitely something to look for in editing is where you can see this doesn't really feel like something somebody would say. It feels like something that allows Alexander to explain. And I think it could have been done much better, maybe in a way that tells us a little bit more about Mazan or something like that. Now, next up, we're going back to some really small scale stuff. Up here, Alexander says right as he agrees, and down here, Alexander says right as he agrees. It's not wrong to ever in your story say, right, he agreed. Although it does come out as a little repetitive, because when you say right, you are agreeing. So you don't really need to do that, but you certainly should not do it 2 times in quick succession. In fact, one quote, he starts it with right, and then his very next quote, he starts it with right. I do this all the time in actual speech, and that is a thing people do when they talk, but it's not something that looks good when you're writing. So it's going to come out in the first draft. That is going to happen. But when you go back and you edit, just keep an eye out for repeated words, repeated phrases. Once your brain latches onto something, you'll find you used it like 5 times in a scene, and you need to edit that out because otherwise the readers will get distracted by that. Now, here we have the king and his council discussing the difference between the words may and should in official documents. Now, it is actually really important in an official document how precisely it's phrased. For instance, may is non-directive. It means you have that option, you have permission, but you don't have to do it. Should means it's overall preferred. In most cases, you should do the thing, but it's not must. So those things are actually really important, and sorry, that was just a little bit of a nerdy thing, but these things are important, but they have lawyers for things like this. The king and his council are not going to be discussing that. Perhaps they will review it, but they don't need to do it on their PowerPoint slides in their official council meeting. And then my final point is how Destiny couldn't let herself lose focus. And the question is why? And you might say, well, she's the crown princess, and so she needs to be paying attention to what's going on. And yes, that is a good answer, but I think you can dive in even more. So she couldn't let herself lose focus. Does she often lose focus? Is this a recurring problem with her? Or perhaps she's just very, very serious about her duties. And it makes me wonder, why is she so serious? Is this a particularly important meeting? Does this have rippling effects moving forward? Because I didn't get the impression reading through this scene that it was that important. So she couldn't let herself lose focus. Well, okay, that's good. But it's not enough to tell me about her character. When you're writing, it's great to make every word pay rent. Make it earn its keep. Instead of just doing one thing, make it say more than one thing. Like, okay, she's getting bored, but she's trying to stay focused. And why is she trying to stay focused? Conveying that in the same place, but not info dumping, just subtly conveying why it's important and what are the stakes can really ramp up the story. So that is the first scene in a first draft of a story, and it is, as I said, kind of cringy, but hopefully you can see, just based on all of that, some things to avoid when writing and things to look for when you're editing your first drafts so that you can make them stronger. I can guarantee if I were to pitch this to an agent, they would look over like the first couple of sentences and be like, no, this person can't pull off writing in a way that's going to hook the readers in. Instead, what they want to see, or what your reader wants to see, is instantly connecting either with a character or at least with a really cool vibe. And they want to see what's going on, what are the stakes, what's the tension. You don't need to start in the middle of a fight scene, but please do not start with 2 paragraphs of info dumping about the legal system. I suppose it could work if you've got a character who's like a total nerd about legal stuff, but my characters are not that. So, anywho, I hope you enjoyed seeing me tear apart my old writing, and let me know in the comments below if this was helpful to you, or if you would be interested in seeing me do this again. Thank you, and have a great day!